He thought he could humiliate her in front of everyone. But he had no idea he had just humiliated the wrong woman. The glass doors of Whitmore and Hale Boutique whispered open as Emily Carter stepped inside, the soft chime barely noticeable against the quiet elegance of the store, where polished marble floors reflected warm golden light and racks of designer dresses stood like curated art pieces, untouched and intimidating. She paused for just a second, taking in the space. Her simple cream cardigan and modest flats quietly out of place among silk gowns priced higher than most people's monthly rent, yet her eyes remained steady, calm, observant, as if she had every right to be there, even if no one else believed it. A sales associate glanced up from behind a pristine white counter, her gaze sweeping over Emily in a single, practiced motion, from her unbranded handbag to her understated clothes, and in that brief second, a judgment was made, filed, and sealed. The smile that followed was polite, but thin, the kind reserved for people who didn't belong. Emily moved slowly toward a midnight blue dress displayed beneath a spotlight, its fabric catching the light like still water at dusk, and she reached out, her fingers brushing the material with quiet admiration, not greed, not hesitation, just appreciation. It was a gift, she thought, something simple yet meaningful, something her mother would have loved years ago before life became complicated, before appearances began to matter more than intentions. "Ma'am," the associate's voice cut in gently but firmly, stepping closer now, her tone controlled, almost rehearsed. "That piece is part of our premium collection." And though the words were technically informative, the implication hung in the air heavier than the chandeliers above them, as if Emily needed permission just to touch it. Emily turned, offering a small, polite smile. "I understand," she said softly, her voice even, respectful, unshaken. But the associate had already taken a subtle step forward, positioning herself just slightly between Emily and the display, a quiet barrier disguised as customer service. Across the boutique, a woman in a tailored black suit observed the interaction, her posture sharp, her heels echoing against the marble as she approached, each step deliberate, authoritative. Vanessa Whitmore, the store manager, carried herself with the confidence of someone who had spent years deciding who was worthy and who was not, and, as she reached them, her eyes flicked toward Emily with a brief, assessing glance that lasted less than a second, yet spoke volumes. "Is there a problem?" Vanessa asked, her tone smooth but edged, not looking at Emily directly at first, but at the associate, who immediately straightened. "No problem," the associate replied quickly. "I was just explaining the collection." Vanessa's gaze finally settled on Emily, a faint smile forming, one that never quite reached her eyes. "These items," she said, gesturing lightly toward the dress, "are typically reserved for our more dedicated clientele." The pause deliberate, the meaning unmistakable. A couple browsing nearby slowed their movement, their attention drifting subtly toward the exchange, curiosity replacing conversation, and in that moment, the air shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough that Emily could feel it, the quiet weight of being watched, measured, and found lacking. She didn't react the way they expected, no embarrassment, no defensive explanation, no hurried apology, just a calm stillness, her hands resting lightly at her sides as she met Vanessa's gaze without challenge, without submission. "I was interested in purchasing it," Emily said simply, her voice steady, almost gentle, and for a fraction of a second, something unreadable passed through Vanessa's expression before it hardened again into practiced composure. "Of course," Vanessa replied, though the word carried no warmth. "However, we do have policies to ensure the experience remains exclusive for all our guests." And then, with a slight tilt of her head, she added, "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable exploring our other selections," her hand gesturing vaguely toward a less prominent corner of the store, where discounted items sat under dimmer lighting. The room didn't erupt, no one laughed outright. But there was a subtle shift, a tightening of silence, a quiet acknowledgement of what was happening, and Emily felt it all without letting it touch her. She looked once more at the dress, then back at Vanessa, her expression unchanged, calm, composed, almost distant. "It's all right," she said after a brief pause, her voice soft but clear enough to carry across the polished floor. "I understand." And with that, She turned toward the exit, her steps unhurried, measured, as if nothing had been taken from her at all, as if the moment belonged entirely to someone else. Behind her, the boutique resumed its quiet rhythm, but something lingered in the air, something unresolved. As the glass doors opened once more, and Emily Carter stepped back into the afternoon light, leaving behind a room that had no idea it had just made a very expensive mistake. The afternoon air outside felt cooler than it should have, or maybe it was just the sudden absence of that suffocating judgment that made Emily Carter pause on the sidewalk, her reflection faintly visible in the boutique's glass behind her, smaller now, distant, like a scene already fading into memory. She adjusted the strap of her bag, her fingers steady, her expression unchanged, but inside, something quiet and old stirred. Not anger, not embarrassment, but recognition, because this was not new to her, not even close. Years ago, before the quiet stability she had built, before the life she now lived with careful intention, she had stood in places just like that, on the wrong side of polished counters and practiced smiles, where worth was measured in labels and appearances, where silence was mistaken for weakness and simplicity for lack. She had learned then that dignity did not come from being accepted in rooms like those. It came from walking out of them unchanged. A city bus rumbled past, its sound grounding her as she stepped forward into the rhythm of the street, blending effortlessly into the flow of people who did not notice her, who did not need to. And for a moment, she allowed herself a small breath, the kind that resets everything, the kind that reminds you who you are when the world tries to suggest otherwise. Her phone vibrated softly in her hand, and she glanced down at the screen, the name lighting up with quiet familiarity, Daniel, and for just a second, her eyes softened, the tension she had not acknowledged easing slightly before she answered. "Hey," she said, her voice calm, almost light, as if nothing had happened at all. "Are you still downtown?" Daniel's voice came through steady and warm, carrying that quiet authority that never needed to prove itself. "I just finished a meeting nearby. I was about to call you. Did you find what you were looking for?" Emily looked back once, not at the people inside, not at the manager or the dresses or the polished floors, but at the door itself, the place where she had crossed from being invisible to being dismissed, and then back again. To herself. "Not exactly," she replied, her tone thoughtful rather than upset. "But it is okay." There was a brief pause on the other end, not silence, but awareness, the kind that comes from knowing someone deeply enough to hear what is not being said. "Are you all right?" Daniel asked, his voice lower now, more focused. Emily smiled faintly, a private expression no one else could see. "I am fine," she said, and she meant it, because she was, but there was a weight behind the words, not heavy, just enough to matter. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, then added, "I stopped by Whitmore and Hale." The name alone was enough, and on the other end of the line, Daniel's tone shifted almost imperceptibly, not with anger, but with clarity, as if a piece of a larger picture had just fallen into place. "I see," he said quietly, and that was all. No questions, no assumptions, just understanding. Emily continued walking, her pace unhurried, her posture straight. "It is nothing important," she said gently, though the words carried more grace than dismissal. "I think I will just head home." Another pause, longer this time, filled with something unspoken, something deliberate. "Stay where you are," Daniel said finally, his voice calm but firm, not commanding, not forceful, just certain. "I will be there in a few minutes." Emily slowed slightly, her brows drawing together just enough to show curiosity. "Daniel, it is really not necessary," she began, but he had already anticipated that response. "I know," he replied, softer now, "but I would like to see you." The words settled between them, simple, sincere, and Emily exhaled quietly, her resistance fading not because she needed help, but because she trusted what those words meant. "All right," she said after a moment, her voice steady again. "I will be near the corner cafe." She ended the call and slipped her phone back into her bag, her gaze lifting toward the street ahead, where sunlight reflected off passing cars and glass buildings, the city moving on as if nothing had happened, and in a way, nothing had, at least not yet. Behind her, through the boutique's pristine windows, Vanessa Whitmore resumed her routine, giving instructions, adjusting displays, maintaining the illusion of control, unaware that the moment she had dismissed was not finished, not even close, because somewhere just a few blocks away, an engine had already started, and the quiet kind of power that did not announce itself was already on its way. The cafe sat quietly on the corner, its outdoor tables catching the late afternoon sun as Emily Carter took a seat near the edge of the sidewalk, her hands resting calmly around a cup of coffee she had not yet tasted, her posture relaxed but composed, as if time itself had slowed just for her, while the city continued moving in soft, distant layers around her. People passed by without noticing. Conversations blurred into background noise, and for a brief moment, everything felt ordinary again. Almost too ordinary, like the world was deliberately holding its breath before something shifted. Inside the boutique, just down the block, Vanessa Whitmore adjusted a display with precise, practiced movements, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor as she surveyed the store with a critical eye, ensuring every detail aligned with the image she had spent years cultivating, an image of exclusivity, perfection, and control. The earlier incident had already been mentally filed away, reduced to nothing more than a minor inconvenience, a forgettable interruption in an otherwise flawless day. And yet, there was a faint tension beneath her composure, something she could not quite name, like a note slightly out of tune in an otherwise perfect composition. One of the sales associates approached her cautiously, lowering her voice just enough to seem discreet. "Do you think she will come back?" she asked, glancing briefly toward the glass doors as if expecting them to open at any second. Vanessa did not look up immediately, her fingers smoothing the fabric of a silk blouse with deliberate care before she responded. "People like that do not come back," she said evenly, her tone calm but dismissive, as if the outcome had already been decided long before the question was asked, and the associate nodded, reassured by the certainty in her voice, though a trace of curiosity lingered in her expression. Outside, Emily glanced at her watch, the subtle movement revealing no impatience, only awareness, as the minutes passed quietly, each one stretching just enough to build anticipation without urgency. She took a small sip of her coffee now, its warmth grounding her, her gaze drifting across the street without focus, not searching, not expecting, simply present. Then, somewhere in the distance, there was a sound, not loud, not dramatic, but distinct, the low, smooth hum of an engine that did not belong to the everyday rhythm of the street, a sound that carried intention rather than noise. And as it grew closer, subtle shifts began to ripple through the scene, a passing pedestrian slowing slightly, a driver pausing at the intersection a second longer than necessary, the kind of small, unconscious reactions people have when something out of the ordinary enters their space. The vehicle appeared moments later, turning the corner with quiet precision, a black sport utility vehicle polished to a mirror finish, its presence commanding attention without demanding it, gliding forward with a kind of effortless authority that made everything around it feel slightly less significant. It pulled up along the curb just across from the boutique, coming to a smooth, deliberate stop, and for a brief second, the street seemed to pause, as if acknowledging its arrival. Emily did not react immediately, her expression unchanged, her posture steady, but there was a subtle shift in her eyes, a recognition, not of the car itself, but of what it represented, and she set her cup down gently, her fingers lingering on the rim for just a moment before releasing it. Inside the boutique, the faint reflection of the vehicle caught Vanessa's attention through the glass, and she turned slightly, her gaze narrowing as she took in the unfamiliar presence outside. Something about it pulling at her focus in a way she could not ignore, and the room seemed to quiet without instruction, conversations lowering, movements slowing, as curiosity spread like a silent signal through the space. The driver stepped out first, his movements precise and efficient, walking around to the rear door with practiced timing, and then, with a smooth motion, he opened it, stepping aside without a word, without announcement, leaving a brief, suspended moment where nothing happened, and yet everything felt like it was about to. Emily rose from her seat then, not hurried, not dramatic, simply standing as she always did, composed, grounded, her gaze steady as she looked toward the vehicle, and across the street, behind the boutique's pristine glass. Vanessa Whitmore watched without understanding, her confidence intact but beginning, just slightly, to falter at the edges, because something was unfolding that she had not anticipated. Something that did not fit within the boundaries she controlled, and as a polished black shoe touched the pavement and a figure began to emerge from the vehicle, the air itself seemed to shift, tightening into a silence that no one had asked for, but no one dared to break, as if the world was preparing to reveal a truth that had been quietly waiting all along. The man who stepped out of the vehicle did not rush, did not look around for approval, and did not need to announce who he was, because everything about him spoke before he ever said a word. Daniel Carter adjusted the cuff of his tailored navy suit with a small, precise movement, his expression calm, focused, and unmistakably composed, the kind of presence that did not seek attention yet commanded it effortlessly. And as he closed the distance between himself and the sidewalk, the quiet hum of the city seemed to fade beneath the weight of his arrival. Emily stood across the street, watching him approach with the same steady gaze she had carried all day, her posture unchanged, her expression softening only slightly as their eyes met, a silent exchange passing between them that needed no explanation, no urgency, just understanding. Daniel reached her within seconds, his steps measured, his attention entirely on her. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low and even, carrying a quiet concern that never turned into alarm. Emily nodded gently. "I am," she replied, her tone calm, her composure intact, and for a moment, the world outside of that small space between them seemed irrelevant. Daniel studied her face for a brief second longer, not searching for answers, but confirming what he already knew. Then his gaze shifted, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with intention, toward the boutique across the street, its glass exterior reflecting the late afternoon light, as if nothing inside had changed at all. "Is that the place?" he asked, his voice still calm, almost conversational. Emily followed his gaze, then gave a small, quiet nod. "It is," she said simply, offering no further explanation, because she did not need to. There was no anger in Daniel's expression, no raised voice, no visible reaction that might match the tension building around them. Only a subtle tightening of focus, the kind that signaled decision rather than emotion, and without another word, he turned toward the crosswalk. Inside the boutique, Vanessa Whitmore watched through the glass as the man began to approach, her earlier confidence now interrupted by something unfamiliar, something she could not immediately categorize. And as he stepped onto the polished sidewalk directly in front of the store, the atmosphere inside shifted again, quieter now, heavier, as if the space itself recognized that something was about to change. The door opened with the same soft chime as before, but this time, the sound seemed louder, sharper, drawing every eye toward the entrance as Daniel Carter stepped inside, his presence altering the room without effort, without announcement. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, movement slowed, and for a brief moment, no one spoke, not because they were told to be silent, but because silence had already taken hold. Vanessa straightened instinctively, her posture sharpening as she moved forward to greet him, her professional composure returning quickly, though not completely. "Good afternoon, sir," she began, her tone polished, welcoming, the exact tone she reserved for clients she recognized as important. "Welcome to Whitmore and Hale." Daniel did not respond immediately, his gaze sweeping the room once, not hurried, not searching, but deliberate, taking in the space, the staff, the arrangement of everything, before settling on her. "Who is in charge here?" he asked, his voice calm, measured, but carrying a weight that made the question feel less like a request and more like a statement. Vanessa blinked once, then stepped forward with a composed smile. "I am," she said confidently, though the certainty in her voice was beginning to thin at the edges. Daniel gave a slight nod, acknowledging her without warmth, without hostility, just recognition, and then, after a brief pause that stretched just long enough to tighten the air in the room, he asked, "Who asked my wife to leave?" The question landed softly, almost gently, but its impact was immediate, unmistakable, and absolute. And in that instant, every sound in the boutique disappeared, replaced by a silence so complete it felt as though even the air had stopped moving. Because the moment everyone had dismissed, the moment they believed was already over, had just returned, and this time, it had a voice. Vanessa Whitmore felt the shift before she could fully process the question, the kind of shift that did not come from raised voices or sudden movement, but from the unmistakable weight of realization beginning to settle in the room, and for the first time. Since she had stepped into her role that morning, her confidence hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, before she straightened her shoulders and forced her expression back into its polished form. "I am not sure I understand," she said carefully, her tone measured, controlled, as if the words themselves could buy her time, but the silence that followed did not offer any relief. It only deepened, stretching across the marble floor and into every corner of the boutique. Daniel Carter did not move, did not raise his voice, did not repeat himself. He simply held her gaze with a calm steadiness that made the question linger far longer than it needed to. And in that stillness, the answer began to surface on its own. One of the sales associates shifted uncomfortably behind the counter, her eyes darting briefly toward Vanessa before lowering again. And another employee near the display racks froze mid-motion, a garment still in her hands, as if she had forgotten what she was doing entirely. Vanessa let out a small breath, almost imperceptible, before stepping forward, her heels echoing softly against the floor. "If there was a misunderstanding earlier, I can assure you that we maintain very high standards of service here," she began, her words carefully chosen, but the confidence behind them no longer carried the same certainty, because now there was context, now there was consequence. Daniel listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, his posture relaxed yet immovable, and when she finished, he gave a slight nod, as if acknowledging that she had spoken, not that she had answered. "That is not what I asked," he said quietly, and the simplicity of the statement cut through the room more sharply than any raised voice could have. Vanessa's composure tightened, her fingers clasping together just slightly as she searched for a response that would restore control, but control was already slipping, not dramatically, not visibly to everyone, but enough that she could feel it. "A woman came in earlier," she admitted finally, her tone more cautious now, "and there may have been some confusion regarding our collections." The words felt smaller as they left her, less certain, less authoritative, and across the room, a customer who had witnessed the earlier interaction exchanged a glance with another, their curiosity now replaced with quiet understanding. Daniel took a single step closer, not aggressive, not rushed, just enough to shift the distance between them, and in that small movement, the tension in the air seemed to tighten again. "Her name is Emily Carter," he said, his voice steady, and she was not confused. The words landed with quiet precision, leaving no space for interpretation, no room for adjustment, and for the first time, Vanessa's expression faltered visibly, her eyes flickering just enough to reveal the realization she had been resisting. Behind him, the glass doors reflected the street outside, where Emily still stood across the way, visible but distant, a quiet presence that had not demanded attention yet now defined the entire moment. Vanessa followed his gaze briefly, her breath catching just slightly as the connection became undeniable, and when she looked back at Daniel, the confidence she had worn so easily before had begun to unravel at the edges. "If she felt uncomfortable, that was certainly not our intention," she said quickly, the words coming faster now, softer, almost defensive, but the room did not respond. No one moved, no one spoke, because everyone understood that intention was no longer the point. Daniel's expression did not change, but there was something final in the way he stood there, something resolved, as if the outcome had already been decided long before he walked through the door. "She did not feel uncomfortable," he said, his voice calm, unwavering. "She was asked to leave." The statement settled over the room like a quiet verdict, undeniable and complete, and once again, the boutique fell into silence, deeper this time, heavier, because now there was no confusion, no misunderstanding, only truth, standing plainly in the space where assumptions had once been enough, and Vanessa Whitmore, for the first time that day, had no immediate answer. The silence did not break immediately. It deepened, stretching across the boutique like a held breath no one dared release. And in that stillness, every person in the room became aware of something shifting beyond their control, something that no longer belonged to polished displays or carefully managed appearances, but to a truth that had already been spoken and could not be taken back. Vanessa Whitmore stood facing Daniel Carter, her posture still upright, still composed on the surface, but the confidence that once filled her voice had begun to thin, replaced by a careful restraint, as if each word now required more effort than the last. If there was any misunderstanding, she began again, her tone softer now, less certain, we would be more than willing to correct it. But even as she spoke, the words lacked the authority they once carried, sounding more like a negotiation than a statement. Daniel did not respond right away, and that pause, brief as it was, seemed to expand in the air between them, drawing attention from every corner of the boutique, where customers and staff alike remained still, watching, listening, waiting. Then, with quiet precision, Daniel reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and withdrew a small, folded document, not hurriedly, not for effect, but with the same deliberate calm that defined everything he did. He unfolded it once, then held it lightly in his hand, not presenting it yet, not announcing its purpose, just allowing its presence to exist in the space, and that alone was enough to shift the tension again. Whitmore and Hale, he said, his voice even, his eyes steady on Vanessa, has built a reputation on exclusivity, and as he spoke, there was no accusation in his tone, only observation, but the weight of the words carried further than any accusation could have. Vanessa nodded slightly, instinctively, as if agreeing with something she had always believed, but now, for the first time, she seemed unsure whether that belief still held the same meaning. Exclusivity can be valuable, Daniel continued, his voice calm, measured, when it is based on quality, on craftsmanship, on service. And then, after a brief pause that sharpened the attention in the room, he added, but not when it is based on assumption. The final words settled into the silence like a quiet conclusion, and Vanessa's expression tightened just enough to reveal that she understood exactly what he meant. Behind her, one of the associates shifted her weight, her hands clasped together as if trying to disappear into the background, while another avoided eye contact entirely, focusing instead on a display that no longer held her attention. Daniel glanced briefly around the boutique, taking in the stillness, the unease, the subtle changes in posture and expression, before returning his attention to Vanessa. My wife came here with the intention to make a purchase, he said, his tone unchanged, steady and clear. And instead, she was evaluated before she was ever served. There was no anger in the statement, no raised voice, but its clarity left no room for denial, no space for reinterpretation, and for a moment, Vanessa said nothing, because there was nothing she could say that would change what had already happened. Outside, through the glass, Emily remained where she was, her figure visible in the reflection, calm, distant, untouched by the tension inside, and that contrast only made the moment inside feel more pronounced, more undeniable. Vanessa took a small breath, her composure gathering itself once more, though not as effortlessly as before. We value all of our clients, she said finally, her voice quieter now, more careful. And if there was an error in judgment, then I take responsibility for that. The words measured, deliberate, as if chosen with precision, but the room did not respond with relief, only with a deeper, more reflective silence. Daniel gave a slight nod, acknowledging her words, but not yet accepting them as enough. And in that quiet acknowledgement, it became clear that this moment was no longer about a single interaction, no longer about a dress or a purchase, but about something far more fundamental, something that could not be resolved with a simple apology or a polished statement. Responsibility is a beginning, he said calmly, not a resolution. And once again, the room fell still, because everyone understood that what came next would not be defined by what was said, but by what was done. Vanessa Whitmore felt the weight of the moment settle more firmly around her, not like pressure from outside, but like something rising from within the room itself, built from every glance, every silence, every unspoken acknowledgement that what had happened could no longer be softened or reframed. She straightened again, drawing in a measured breath, as if preparing to reclaim control. But the control she had once carried so effortlessly now felt distant, replaced by a careful awareness that every word she spoke would matter far more than it had just minutes ago. Then allow me to resolve it, she said, her tone steady but noticeably more restrained. We would be honored to welcome your wife back and assist her personally. And though the offer was polished, even respectful, it carried the faint echo of something reactive rather than genuine, as if it had been shaped by the situation rather than by principle. Daniel Carter listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, his posture still composed, and for a brief moment, he said nothing, allowing the offer to exist in the space, to be fully heard, fully understood, before he responded. Welcoming her back now, he said quietly, does not change how she was treated when she first walked in, and the simplicity of the statement stripped away any illusion that the situation could be undone with courtesy alone. Vanessa's lips parted slightly, as if to respond, but no words came immediately, because the truth of what he said required more than a quick reply. It required acknowledgement, and that was something far more difficult to offer. Across the room, the staff remained still, their earlier confidence replaced by a quiet tension that made even the smallest movements feel significant, and one of the associates lowered her gaze completely, unable to meet the scene unfolding before her. Daniel glanced once more toward the glass doors, where Emily's reflection remained visible, calm and distant, and then he reached into his jacket again, this time unfolding the document he had been holding, the paper crisp, deliberate, and unmistakably official in its presence. He extended it slightly, not forcefully, not dramatically, simply placing it within Vanessa's view. Whitmore and Hale is part of a larger investment portfolio, he said, his tone still even, one that values not only profit, but standards, and the word lingered just long enough to carry its full meaning. Vanessa's eyes dropped to the document, her focus sharpening as she took in the details, and for the first time, her composure faltered in a way that could not be hidden, her breath catching just slightly as recognition replaced uncertainty, because what she was looking at was not a complaint, not a customer dispute, but a connection she had not anticipated. Daniel continued, his voice steady. My firm holds a controlling interest in the parent group that oversees this location. And the words settled into the room with a quiet finality that no one could ignore. The effect was immediate, though not loud, not chaotic, just a deep, undeniable shift, as if the foundation of the room itself had tilted slightly beneath everyone's feet. Vanessa lifted her gaze slowly, her expression no longer confident, no longer controlled in the way it had been before, but something else entirely, something closer to realization, to consequence, and in that moment, the authority she had carried just minutes earlier seemed to dissolve into something far more fragile. Behind her, one of the associates took a small step back, the movement barely noticeable but significant enough to mark the change, while another looked toward the door as if reconsidering everything that had just happened. Daniel did not raise his voice, did not emphasize the statement, because he did not need to. The truth of it carried its own weight, and after a brief pause, he added, what happened today is not aligned with those standards, his tone calm, but absolute. The room fell into silence again, deeper than before, heavier, because now the situation had moved beyond perception, beyond interpretation, into something undeniable, something that could not be dismissed or minimized, and Vanessa Whitmore stood at the center of it, no longer the one defining the moment, but the one being defined by it, as the quiet consequences of a single decision unfolded around her in real time. The words did not echo, they did not need to, because their impact settled instantly into every corner of the boutique, reshaping the atmosphere in a way that could not be undone, and Vanessa Whitmore felt it fully now, not as a passing discomfort, but as a complete shift in position, as if the ground beneath her had quietly moved while she was still standing on it. Her gaze dropped once more to the document in her hands, the details no longer abstract, no longer distant, but immediate and undeniable, and when she looked back up at Daniel Carter, the difference in her expression was no longer subtle. It was clear, unmistakable, a recognition that she was no longer addressing a customer, but answering to something far greater than her own authority. I was not aware, she said, her voice softer now, stripped of its earlier certainty, each word measured carefully, as if she understood that precision was now her only defense, but even that felt insufficient in the face of what had already been revealed. Daniel regarded her quietly, his posture unchanged, his presence still grounded and composed, and for a moment, he allowed the silence to remain, not as pressure, but as space. Space for understanding to settle fully before anything more was said. Awareness, he replied calmly, should not be a requirement for respect, and the statement, simple as it was, carried a weight that settled deeper than any accusation because it spoke not to status, but to principle. Vanessa's breath caught slightly at that, not from shock, but from the clarity of it, the kind of clarity that left no room for justification, no room for reframing, only acknowledgement. Behind her, the staff stood in complete stillness now, the earlier tension replaced by something quieter, more reflective, as if each person in the room was reconsidering not just the moment, but their role within it. One associate slowly set down a garment she had been holding, her movements careful, deliberate, as though even the smallest action required thought. Daniel shifted his attention briefly toward the displays, the polished surfaces, the carefully arranged luxury that had once defined the space, and then back to Vanessa, his expression steady. This store represents a brand, he continued, his tone even, but more importantly, it represents a standard, and again, that word lingered, heavier now, more defined. Vanessa nodded faintly, though the motion carried none of her earlier confidence, only agreement, quiet and unavoidable. And today, Daniel said, that standard was not upheld. There was no emphasis, no rise in his voice, but the finality of the statement left no room for negotiation, no space for softening, and the silence that followed felt different this time, not tense, not uncertain, but settled, as if the truth had reached its full weight and no longer needed to be reinforced. Vanessa lowered her gaze briefly, her shoulders drawing in just slightly, not in defeat, but in acceptance, and when she looked up again, her expression had changed, not back to control, not back to authority, but to something more grounded, more real. You are right, she said quietly, the words simple, direct, and for the first time, fully aligned with the moment, and I take full responsibility for that. The room remained still, but the quality of the silence shifted again, no longer heavy with tension, but steady, as if something had been acknowledged that could not be ignored. Daniel gave a slight nod, acknowledging her words, and then, after a brief pause, he turned his gaze once more toward the door, where the reflection of Emily still lingered in the glass, calm, composed, unchanged by everything that had unfolded inside. My wife did not ask for an apology, he said, his voice softer now, but no less clear. And she does not need one to know her worth. And as he spoke, there was no bitterness, no anger, only certainty, the kind that comes from knowing something deeply and completely. Vanessa followed his gaze again, seeing Emily not as she had before, but differently now, not as someone who did not belong, but as someone she had failed to recognize, and in that realization, the full weight of the moment settled in completely. Daniel turned back to her, his expression calm, resolved, and added, what matters is what happens next. And with that, the moment shifted once more, not ending, but moving forward, leaving behind everything that had been assumed, and opening the space for something that could no longer be ignored. For a moment, no one moved, not because they were unsure of what to do, but because the weight of what had already happened held them in place. And in that stillness, something quieter began to take shape, something that did not come from authority or status, but from understanding. Daniel Carter remained where he stood, his posture unchanged, his expression steady, as if the outcome he sought was not dramatic, not immediate, but inevitable, shaped by what had already been revealed rather than what still needed to be said. Vanessa Whitmore stood across from him, her earlier confidence now replaced with a composed awareness, the kind that comes only after realization has fully settled, and for the first time that day, she was not reacting, not defending, but considering, carefully and deliberately. She turned slightly toward her staff, her voice calm, but different now, no longer carrying the sharp edge of control, but something steadier, more grounded. Everyone, she said, her tone clear, drawing their attention without force. I want you to remember this moment. And the words, simple as they were, carried a weight that made the room listen in a way it had not before. The associates straightened subtly, their earlier discomfort giving way to quiet focus, because this was no longer just an incident, it was a lesson unfolding in real time. Vanessa continued, her gaze moving briefly across the room before returning to Daniel. What happened here today does not represent who we should be, she said. And there was no hesitation now, no attempt to soften the truth, only acknowledgement, direct and complete. Daniel watched her for a brief moment, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not in approval, but in recognition that something had shifted in a way that mattered. Without another word, he turned toward the door, his movements calm, unhurried, as if the purpose of his presence had already been fulfilled, and as he stepped outside, the light of the late afternoon met him again, steady and unchanged, just as Emily Carter stood waiting across the sidewalk, her posture as composed as ever. Their eyes met once more, and this time, there was no tension, no question, only quiet understanding, the kind that needs no explanation. Daniel crossed the street toward her, each step measured, the distance between them closing without urgency, and when he reached her, he did not speak immediately, because he did not need to, his presence alone enough to say everything that mattered. Emily looked at him, her expression calm, her eyes steady, and after a brief moment, she gave a small nod, as if acknowledging not what had been done, but what had been understood. Together, they turned slightly away from the boutique, not in avoidance, not in dismissal, but simply because there was nothing left for them there, nothing they needed to reclaim, nothing they had lost. Behind them, through the glass, Vanessa Whitmore watched in silence, her reflection blending with the scene outside, her expression thoughtful, no longer defined by control, but by awareness. And as the couple walked away, unhurried, composed, the boutique remained still, not empty, not unchanged, but different in a way that could not be reversed. The polished floors still reflected the same light. The displays remained perfectly arranged, but something unseen had shifted beneath it all, something that would linger long after the moment itself had passed. And in that quiet aftermath, one truth remained, steady and undeniable, that respect is not granted by appearance, and it is never defined by who is allowed to stay, but by how we choose to treat those we believe do not belong. Because sometimes, the person we overlook is the one who reminds us what dignity truly looks like.